and welcome to part C, Mechanisms of Evolution. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different things in this section. Like I said, this is the unit we're going to get really into the meat of evolution. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is genetic variation. And what is genetic variation? It is very, very important for a population to have genetic variation in it, because if the environment changes, you hopefully will have some individuals within your population that have the right set of traits to survive. Evolution is not about the survival of the individual. It is about the survival of the species. And we can even narrow that down to a population. So we can see here with our ladybugs, we have all different colors, different patterns of spots. And that is, that is a different type of variation amongst this population of ladybugs. Factors that affect genetic variation would be reproductive rates. The faster the organism reproduces, the quicker we can observe the changes in the population. For example, bacteria. We used to say that evolution was too slow to observe, but bacteria can reduce, especially E. coli can undergo cell division every 20 minutes. So you can see several generations within, 24 hours. And we have been able to see very quick change in the ability for bacteria to become antibiotic resistant. So we can observe those changes, and we see those changes today in our lifetime. Right now, human evolution is a little different because our generation time used to be every 20 years, but now we're a little older when we have kids. So probably about closer to 25 years. So it's going to take a long time to see several generations take place. All right. Sexual reproduction. So that's what we're talking about here. Again, that, we reproduce by sexual, not asexual reproduction. We can see that these diploid, that these organisms that are diploid, right? We have two copy, can be carried without being expressed, and we call those carriers. So we can see that some traits stay hidden in the population until two carriers come together and have a child. And then we may see that in the offspring that has that, what we call the homozygous recessive, which we just talked about that in our genetics. So we could have two heterozygous individuals that don't show or express that trait, and then they have a child and they have it. Okay. So sources of variation, mutations, mistakes in making our copies of DNA may give us different set of instructions. So those are replication errors. And in this case, like blue eyes did not exist. It was a mutation. We just had brown eyes, and then we had a mutation in the gene that gives us pigment for our eyes, and there we have blue. We also have something called altering gene number. Now, during meiosis, we can have crossing over. We talked about a little bit about crossing over. Sometimes that crossover may not go right. And so what you might end up getting is a duplication where it didn't cross over evenly. So one gamete gets two copies of a gene and the other one's missing one. We could have a term, slippage, where when we're replicating our DNA, we kind of make a mistake there. And like I was saying, uneven crossing over. Okay. So different ways of getting a different number of genes. Here's a picture of gene duplication. So we can see that we have this gene here. We would have had a crossing over, but it didn't happen correctly. In fact, we're having basically a crossover with a chromosome that's not, it's homologous, it's a partner, it's crossing over with somebody it shouldn't be crossing over with. And so now we end up with multiple copies of a gene. And this allows for, when we have multiple copies of the same gene, it allows for some tinkering here. So as long as we have one good copy and it makes the protein that we need to to survive, it's okay. But when we have multiple copies, it allows for some tinkering to go on and mutations to either build up or accumulate to the point where it may give us a different protein. And that protein may be hurtful or helpful. And so this is just one of the ways that we can get um, evolution. All right. So changes in that those characteristics. All right. So competition is really important, okay? Because when we have competition, we're basically competing for some kind of resource, whether it's food, water, living space, or a mate. They're competing for a mate. So when we're talking about fitness, we're talking about how well an individual can survive and produce more offspring. We're not talking about who can run the mile in in under 5 minutes. We're talking about who has the right traits in their environment to be successful. And that success is measured in the ability to produce healthy, fertile offspring, because we need to keep passing those genes from generation to generation. So it doesn't do you any good if you have kids and they can't have kids. All right. So that is how we're going to explain and use that word fitness. So adaptation, so again, an adaptation is a characteristic that allows them to be more successful in their environment. We're going to talk, about Darwin's finches. And you can see with Darwin's finches, they all have a little bit of a different type of beak. Now, the original flock of birds that came to the Galapagos Islands, there were just one group of finches. And then over thousands of years, they diverged based on their habitat, and individuals that had certain characteristics, especially their beak size and shape, made them successful in those particular environments, whether there was small seeds, large seeds, they were eating cacti, insects, depending on that food type. So that particular type of beak made them more successful. Adaptive radiation is when many new species arise from one line. And we've kind of seen some of that when we talked about the history of our Earth. When we have a major catastrophe and an extinction event, it opens up habitats, or what we call niches. Niches are a habitat and how it provides for itself. You can kind of say, I don't want to use the word a trophic level, but where it fits in that environment. Is it an herbivore? Is it an omnivore? Is it an autotroph, a heterotroph? So how does it fit? What is its role in that ecological habitat? All right. So again, we're commonly see those after we have a mass extinction. So we have a mass extinction here. In this particular group, it was most likely the KT extinction, the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, and it really opened up the environment for the adaptive radiation of mammals. Here is, again, Darwin's finches. So we can see that ancestral finch there, and now depending on what type of food and, that food availability on that part of the island, those we see over, thousands of years. I mean, look at how different those beaks have become, and those have now become different species. So when we talk about natural selection, we always like to talk about the peppered moth. So I'm going to throw a little of our genetics in here. So we have, a phenotype. So we have dark, dark, and light. Now notice the dark is dominant. The lighter color is recessive. We can see we have the homozygous, heterozygous, homozygous, recessive. And we can see those represented. We have our phenotype and our genotype, and we're seeing the genes on the chromosomes. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, the trees in England were this lighter color. So you could see that the lighter moth definitely had an advantage from predation. The darker moths would be easily seen by predators and eaten. During the Industrial Revolution, this is when we burned coal as our fuel source for industry, and that soot landed on everything. Everything was covered in soot, including the trees. And so the bark on the trees became darker. And now the darker moth has an advantage to this new change in the environment. And the lighter ones are going to get picked off by predators. And that's okay, because overall, these moths, the population will survive because of that variation. Again, it's not about survival of the individual, it's the survival of the population. So we can look at this graph here and we can see that we had the white moths were going up, the dark ones were getting eaten. And then all of a sudden we had that Industrial Revolution event, and we can see how now the numbers are changed. The dark moths go up and the light ones are going down. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, we started cleaning up our act, right? We started being more environmentally responsible. The trees went back to light. And in this case, notice now the light moths are represented in higher numbers. Okay, so we're seeing, this is evolution. We are seeing a change in the frequency of the black to white moths. You may not think, oh, that's not really what you think of evolution, but it is population evolution. That population has changed. Okay, we have changed in the frequency in which we see the light versus the dark color moth in that population. Now, divergent evolution is where you have a common ancestor, and what happens is they change based on their environment. They kind of go, so they have a common ancestor right here, and then they kind of diverge, right? Diverge means to go apart, okay? The structures may be similar, but they're modified for a purpose. So if we look at this, we also use homologous structures for this. Homologous means homo means the same. So if we look at this, and we talked about this, remember when we did our evidence for evolution? They have one bone, two bones, one bone, two bones, one bone, whoop, two bones, one bone, two bones. And then we have all the other bones in the wrists and the hands. They're all organized very similarly. Now they have been modified so their structures are the same, their functions are different. They do different things. The human arm grabs and works tools, cat running and catching prey, whale swimming, and a bat flying, right? So their functions diverge, but they did come from a common ancestor. So here we have our four-winged ancestral insect, and we can see how they have changed over time, okay? So they're the same, okay? But they have a little bit of different, like some of this was modified for some protection. We still have four wings here, and then we had a reduction in the wings there, okay? So we can see how they're the same structure. In this case, they're the same function. They've just been modified a little bit. Okay. Now, convergent is the opposite. This is where an organism lives in a similar habitat and they use the same concept. Idea is the same on how to survive in that same environment, but they are not from a common ancestor, and they generally do not use the same body parts. Okay. So for example, a sugar glider and a flying squirrel. Yes, they're both mammals, but they are not closely related at all. One is a marsupial and one is an eutherian or a placental mammal. Right. So if we look at these two organisms, you would think that they're very closely related. They are not. Okay. So we have the flying squirrel. Now, squirrels are placental mammals, meaning that they give birth to their babies. They carry them in utero, give birth to them, and then they just nurse them until they're fully developed. Now, a sugar glider is from Australia. These organisms, they have a uterus, but they deliver their baby very, very, they're still like basically a fetus when they give birth to that. I don't want to say embryo, but it is kind of an embryo. It's really, really small. And then it has to climb into a pouch where it will then hook up to a nipple and it will finish developing. It's not even fully developed. Doesn't even, like, the back legs may not even be, especially if you watch a kangaroo, the back legs are not even really fully developed at all. They're just little stubs. All right, so they are going to finish most of their, I'm going to say embryonic development in that pouch. And then they will continue to go in and out of the pouch as they get older until they're fully, weaned and on their own. So they have solved the problem of jumping from tree to tree and avoid predation with extending that flap of skin here. All right, so they have that similar adaptation, but it's not because they share a common ancestor. Okay, they do way back in history. Okay, but not any time in recent history. All right. And this just kind of shows you some of that the similarities between these organisms. So if we look at Australia, it's really kind of interesting because um, when we talk about Australia kind of, you could think of it as a big island, right? It kind of separated off from when we split up from Pangea. Marsupials were not very successful in other habitats around the world, but they did get a foothold into Australia. And so since Australia has similar habitats um, from other uh, places in the world where placental mammals actually dominate, you can see how they look very similar. Here are these two different moles, the anteaters, the mice. Okay, so you see here's our flying squirrel again, our bobcat, and then our Tasmanian wolf versus a wolf. Okay, so remember, all those marsupials have pouches. So their development is different. Their reproductive development's different. Okay. All right, so that is, I guess I don't have an ending slide. I like having an ending slide, so I know I'm done. So that is the end of this little presentation. So basically, you should understand if we were to go back to, let's see if I can go back to the beginning. Let's see if I can do that. Oh, back. There we go. Okay, so we talked about variation. Summary here. We talked about variation. That's the changes in the characteristics in a population. We talked about competition. We talked about adaptations. And then we talked about selection. And now we're going to move forward into more of the, we're going to get into micro and macro evolution next. So you need to keep in mind your different structures: homologous, analogous, and convergent and divergent evolution. All right. Hopefully this is helpful, and I will see you in the next video.